Hello, everybody. My name is Lat Mackey, and this is Sequence Break IL, a look at speedrunning, game development, content creation, and everything in between. Thanks so much for being here and listening and watching and liking and all of that fun jazz. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. We're at the end of May. I'm recording this at the end of May and kind of right in the middle of Summer Games Done Quick 2023, which this year is a week or two earlier than it has been in the years past. I think it's a week earlier. And I got to say, for me, that meant that I actually couldn't attend. And personally, it's the first one I've missed since 2018. And so I'm a little bummed, obviously, really excited to see so many, different people get their moments on the couch and doing their runs and all that kind of fun stuff. It's the runs that I've caught, which haven't been too many because the reason I couldn't attend is because I'm still working and all that kind of stuff, but have been really fun to watch. Just yesterday, I was watching ADEF's Ratatouille run, and I was getting the nostalgia vibes because we've seen ADEF since 15, 16, I don't know. He's been doing runs for quite a long time now at Games Done Quick. So to see him back on there and doing his thing, playing a game like Ratatouille, yes, chef. If you've seen, you know what I'm talking about. Watch his run. It's a lot of fun. But I got to say that it's got a fun schedule so far, and we haven't run even halfway through yet. So good old school, new school, a bunch of cool stuff, indies, all these kind of new stuff and a bunch of Saturday is going to be stacked with just a bunch of classic runs that I'm super excited to watch and get a chance to see how much money we can raise for charity and all that kind of fun stuff. But as I mentioned, I was feeling a little bit nostalgic, and it reminded me of a conversation that I was very fortunate to have back in November of 2020. And there is this great panel that Mike Uyama and Breakdown and a couple others did way back in the day. I can't remember which event it was at, but they talk all about the history of Games Done Quick. And I'm going to link to it in the description because it's a really deep dive on kind of the numbers and how things came to be and kind of like the facts and the things that happened to make that happen. And I was fortunate enough to host a show on the Games Done Quick channel. It was called Games Done Classic, where we looked back at classic moments from different GDQs. And this one specifically, I thought it'd be interesting to hear from the runners and from Mike, because Mike was a runner at the very first GDQ as well. And so check out this panel: Mike Uyama, Frezyman, and andrewg. If you're not familiar with Frezyman, maybe you're a little bit newer to speedrunning and you're not familiar with him. Classic OG, was at the very first Games Done Quick. One of the, we're talking a whole different vibe and a whole different time of speedrunning when speedrun.com wasn't even around. It hadn't even been invented yet, or whatever it was going to be. So a lot of information and the way we got things and the way you got runs verified and all that kind of fun stuff at this point was done through a website called Speed Demo Archives, or SDA, which you can still actually go see and kind of trope through the historical records and see what's been done. But Frezyman was just such an incredible individual, putting up times like you wouldn't believe in Contra and so many other different games and runs. In fact, I think he had 10 different runs at the very first GDQ. I can't remember exactly, but the classic clip you may remember is at some point Frezyman's going to rip off his shirt during it. And if you haven't seen the run, it's totally fun and totally silly. Highly recommend it. The other one is andrewg, and both of these individuals, andrewg and Frezyman, definitely are some of the people that really, I saw and I'm like, these are just, I can't believe what these people are doing. andrewg, for those of you that don't know, but I can't, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably do. Super Mario Brothers fame, the first sub 5-minute run in Super Mario Brothers, the original. And besides that, so many other things. One of my favorite runs he does is Excite Bike, but I think he ran 10 or 15, a ton of games at the very first event, which was called Games Done Classic Games Done Quick. My bad. My show was called Games Done Classic. The first event was called Classic Games Done Quick. And so there's a bunch of cool little details and how this whole thing came to be and how they even just decided to take that risk and leave their house. At this point, many of these speedrunners had only communicated online or in forums or GameFAQs forums, or SDA's forums, all these different places. And so at some point, they decided to take the risk and travel to, at this time, the East Coast to go doing some speedrunning for charity and what all that meant. And we wouldn't have what we have today, which is basically still our Super Bowl of speedrunning, if it weren't for some of these individuals. There weren't many, but they all squeezed into Mike Uyama's mother's basement to try to pull off a charity marathon. And just fortunate that we have video of it today and all that kind of stuff. So some super fun stories, super interesting stuff. I'm not linking to the whole thing. If you want to watch, we do dive into some of the actual specifics of each individual run a little bit later on. So I'll link to the actual full episode if you're interested in that. But this is a kind of just a very basic setup and what it was like back then speedrunning, and also what was it like to attend and to start this whole first Games Done Quick before Games Done Quick was Games Done Quick. So hope you enjoy Mike Uyama, andrewg, and Frezyman back from 2020. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Awesome. Okay, everyone's unmuted. This is great. We are ready to go. So before we get into some of the runs and watching some of the things that we're going to be watching today, I'd like to take us all back a little bit. And Mike, I'm going to ask you to set the stage a bit and really, like, how did this idea of this charity speedrunning event even start? Where did this whole thing come about?
Well, back in 2009, there were basically two events, video game charity fundraising events, and they were Desert Bus for Hope and the Speed Gamers, who ironically were not speedrunners, but they would basically focus on a series and play through them and fundraise for charity that way. And we looked at both of these events and we're like, oh, we can do this. We want to do this. And so, being speedrunners, we're like, we can do this better because we can do this fast. It turns out that it was a lot harder than we thought it was. And I definitely respect both groups for what they do. But that was kind of where the idea came from. And now while, speedrunning, marathons, raising money for charity, it's pretty common nowadays. Back then it was, in 2009, it was unheard of.
So I've had a chance to hang out and get to meet some of the people who made the first one even possible, the runners and the participants and the people behind the scenes. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, what was the speedrunning community like at the time? Like, were there leaderboards? How did you all know who was putting up what times for what game and things like that?
There were no leaderboards. Putting runs up on YouTube was not that common in 2009, even though YouTube was a thing in 2009. Really, the majority of the speedrunning community was in Speed Demos Archive. And while not too many people use that site nowadays, it was basically the source for speedrunning back in 2009. Speedruns Live just had like 3 or so races in 2009. So speedrunning races wasn't really much of a thing back then. And speedrun.com just simply did not exist.
It's kind of amazing because I got a chance to talk with Frezyman about this. Frezyman, first off, I know you were running a ton of games back in those late aughts of the 2000s, but the process you mentioned of how you'd have to submit your run. First of all, tell us where you are in the world, and then how would you submit your speed runs back in those days?
So I am a Swede, so live in Sweden, and when the 2D games were submitted, I think in about the first videos, probably 2004. The first years, it was very common that you were recording your run with an VHS tape or VCR tape in US. So my first run, I think it was Mega Man 3, 2005, and I recorded my first runs with the VHS tape. And I think I was one of the few or first European runners I was shipping one tape at the time to Nathan Yankee in Texas. So it was a post package, and I sent it there, and he was good enough to translate it into get things digital and into the site. So
capture it.
Yeah, just capture it. Andrew, I know, thankfully, we have a lot of your runs because you've recorded them. What made you even think about recording one of your runs early on?
Really, I've always liked the Super Mario Brothers games and Nintendo games in general. So when I was I don't know, maybe 13, 14, I stumbled upon some speedruns and I thought, is it possible to record this? How do you do that? And I just hooked up a VCR and it does work. That's really easy. You just hook up a VCR to a TV and hit record. And so I eventually found my way to Speed Demos Archive after being on Twin Galaxies for like a year or so. And I was like, oh, these guys are really cool. Like this is a dedicated speedrun website. And it was cool to hang that and be able to actually submit my run somewhere.
Mike, if you don't mind, tell us, when did you get involved with SDA, and was there any evolution? Like, how did the site go from? How did they change? How did they start accepting and doing the speedrunning thing as well?
So I got involved in 2004, which was the start of Speed Demos Archive, when they started accepting games outside of Quake. Because originally it was a Quake speedrunning site. And the reason why it was called, and the reason why it has demos in the name, is because of the demo files from Quake that they would use to, to record their records. Because, back in like the late 90s and early 2000s, capture equipment was not common, and it was also expensive, and it was a lot more difficult to do than it is nowadays, where it's pretty easy to do and affordable.
Pretty cool. I know it's interesting because a lot of SDA still exists. The forums and you can actually start looking back through some of the history of all of this still today. It's kind of interesting.
That was one of the ways I did my research now, to just try to remember everything. Like all these forum topics is still there, so it's great to do some research.
Yeah, when I did my Classic Games Done Quick panel, I had to look at some of the original threads, and they were still there. They were a little difficult to find, but I did find them, and I was able to kind of remember some things that I said and see some things that I said that I completely did not remember at all. And since you were asking about the evolution of the site of SDA, it's really just like accepting more and more types of runs, and I guess being more flexible in rulings. Like, even though, a lot of the basic stuff of speedruns, like, the any percent, low percent, and 100%, that comes from, SDA. It's called RTA now, but it used to be called single segment when it came to doing runs all in one session. And now with live streaming, that's kind of more expected because, it's not, it's not as entertaining, and it doesn't really flow as well to constantly be saving and loading one segment of a run when you're streaming nowadays, and it doesn't really work that well for a marathon either.
Well, so this is fascinating, and one of the things that we are fortunate enough to have nowadays is this really easy communication platforms. We can share strategies, we can share videos, we can help each other out in a way that who would have thought 10 or 15 or 20 years ago would have even been possible. Andrew, I'm going to throw this one over to you. I know you're primarily known for a lot of Mario games, but you were speedrunning a bunch of games before I even knew speedruns existed. Are these things that you were developing yourselves, or were you able to share any strats or anything with your runs with anybody else, or is this something you were doing on your own?
I mostly, as far as strategy goes, I mostly like they were saying, use the Speed Demos Archive forums, and it's basically you would put up a run, and you would be speedrunning a game, and you'd just make a thread and be like, does anyone speedrun this?
I mean, this is kind of hard to think of nowadays, but because now the biggest community speedrunners have hundreds or even 1,000 plus runners. But back in the days of SDA, if your run, if the game that you ran had more than one runner, then that was a pretty big game, because usually the speedrunning community was pretty small, and even popular games would only have maybe a couple of runners. So things were much smaller back then. And sometimes people feel like our community is tiny, we only have 5 active runners. I'm like, that's pretty good.
Sometimes you put some threads up and get no response too, and it'd just be like, okay, I guess I'll just figure this out myself.
I can add that it was a big frustration in some games that there was no run for it, and no one was discussing any runs either. So I probably was one of the first did a bounty on some games. So I think, Andrew, did I actually ended up paying you for the werewolf run on NES?
Yeah. Freddie put up a werewolf, the last warrior for NES bounty for someone to do a speedrun on it, and I just happened to see the game at a game store that I visited, and I was like, oh, I guess I'll try this, and I actually really ended up enjoying the game and ended up even doing a task of it eventually. Yeah, it was just funny because it's like, oh, there's a bounty here. This is great.
It's making me chuckle too, from saying that you had to find a game at a game store, because I mean, flashcards weren't a thing at this time. I'm assuming in the mid 2000s.
No,
right.
If they existed, then they were not commonplace at all, and I don't think they existed back in the late 2000s or early 2010s.
So then I'm curious, Andrew and Frezzy and Mike, because you were speedrunning at the same time. How would you practice? If would you just have to play the game the whole way through, or is there another way to break the game and make it possible to actually do some practice?
It depended on the game, but I would frequently use an emulator to practice, and which didn't always translate 100% because like emulators back then weren't as accurate, so they wouldn't always correctly emulate the lag and stuff like that. Right. But that did help. If it was like a more modern game with like a saving system, then I would just practice the levels that way. But yeah, there was no like a flashcard practice and right. With all their save states, all of their conveniences that really help out for today's runs. And practice ROMs definitely didn't exist back then. The practice ROM was just, if you could emulate it, then great.
And one question there: you had like input lag in your controllers as well when you was practicing, right?
On emulator, probably. I didn't really pay that much attention to it.
Okay.
For me, I hate using emulators just because of the input lag. I've never had a lot of luck with that. So for me, I always basically I would just take a game and be like, how do I get a lot of lives in this game, and then rack up a ton of lives and like go to certain segments and try to get good at certain parts. I did that I remember doing that with Mario too, because there was no way to really practice the later stages without just like pulling up a bunch of lives. That was basically the only thing I could think to do.
That's actually not a bad idea. I'd gotta love the 2005 strats where you had to just live up, get some continues, and go play that level a bunch of times. So that brings up another interesting point. As we're starting to move towards the first live event ever, how many different games were you all? I mean, would you all speedrun a bunch of different games, or did you have games that you were just kind of focusing on in the late 2000s, around 2009, 2010 time? Mike, I'll start with you. Were you running a lot of games, or?
2009, I think the only game that I ran like 2 games in 2009, and I think it was Sunset Riders and Contra 3.
Nice.
But when it came to classic games done quick, and I can go into more detail later, I ran somewhere around like 10 games for it, and they were just games I had ran throughout the years.
Got it. Okay. And then Frezzy?
It's the same here. I think I found the old schedule for the marathon, and I was attempting 16 runs for the marathon. I think was the plan.
I think you did 15 runs.
15.
You definitely did the most runs.
Yeah, and it's I was not only like running the games I had the record for. I was also doing some casual speed runs for some games. So. Maybe we'll come to that later, but when we were planning the marathon, like many players wanted to see like the popular games, and we didn't have any like the world record holder will not be there. So I said that, hey, I can run that game in this time, and I can run this game in this time, and it ended up that they wanted to see Metroid and Mega Man 2 and other games. So yeah, it was what it was. Like my practice hours before the marathon was not that great in all the games, but yeah, a lot of games.
Andrew,
I
how many did you end up
remember
running?
you pulled an all-nighter practicing all of your games at like in a row or something like that. Like right.
Sorry, I
before
lost
the
you
event.
there. What did you say, Mike?
I remember you pulled an all-nighter, like practicing all of your games in a row.
Sounds like
classic games done quick.
Yeah.
Andrew, how about you?
I did a lot of runs also. I just remember. Yeah, it was kind of like, what games can people run, and other popular games that people are interested in. And I just remember doing like F-Zero and what else did I even do? Marble Madness. And anyway, I did a whole bunch of games, and I remember like I put in a lot of practice in these games, but for the marathon, not all of them went all that well. But it was a lot of fun.
So, Mike, if you wouldn't mind, as we're starting to move towards this very first event, to my understanding, there really hadn't been a place where speedrunners had gotten together, like in real life. That kind of thing hadn't happened. Am I mistaken, or could you at least set the scene a little bit for having an event like this?
You're mostly not mistaken. We had only met once before at MagFest the year previous, at the beginning of 2009. And that's why we originally wanted Classic Games Done Quick to be at MagFest, because, it was a fairly big convention, not as big as it is today, but it was still fairly big back then. We thought they would have the resources to help us pull off an event. But yeah, for the most part, you're right. We've only had one meetup in person before then. It's not commonplace like they are nowadays, whether it's a GDQ or like other smaller events like Midwest Speed Fest and stuff and the like.
Absolutely. And I'm curious how you were able to contact or recruit runners. I'll first ask you, Mike, how you sent out the thing that this was happening. And then I'm curious about how Andrew and Frezi possibly even heard about this thing to go do some speedruns at.
Well, as mentioned before, everything happened on Speed Demo's archive. So it was just all on the forums. And I remember I had just come back home from vacation, and like a lot of people wanted to do a charity event, but it was very like not focused, and people were just suggesting the games they could run, and like there was no consideration whether they wanted to be in person or like a remote or anything like that. So I decided it needed more focus, and I decided on classic games, hence the name Classic Games Done Quick, mainly because I felt like that was our strong suit at the time. Like we had a lot of good like 8 and 16-bit runners, especially here in the States. So I figured that would be best for our focus. And at the time, I decided we should do it at MagFest because, as I said before, lots of resources we had met there before.
Makes sense. Andrew, I'll start with you. First of all, it sounds like you may have heard about this in the forums, but what made you decide to get involved?
Yeah. So, I saw it on the forums. I saw a few different people suggesting some sort of marathon or meetup. And it seemed like a lot of fun. I mean, I watched all these guys speedruns, and I was like, this would be great to meet these people, and share that hobby. And I was just like, I was really excited to meet everyone and to talk about games with people. And the fact that it was like, oh, this is like for charity, like, oh, that seems cool. I could do a little traveling, do this and have some fun. And I never thought it would turn into what it is now.
No one did.
But I talked to a lot of you guys, Freddie, Mike. I talked to a lot of people on the forums, and so it was cool to finally meet a lot of you guys live in person.
And then, Frezyman, it kind of blows me away even more that you decided to fly over an ocean just to do a speedrunning event. How did you? What's kind of your story to get you there?
For some years, you are pretty much like living in the forum, or like you watch it too much for your own good and reading the news and all these threads, and you're so much into running these games. And you talk with like many other runners, but you never see their faces. And I think like that the first MagFest meetup we had, it was I didn't hesitate to come over like right away, like I'm going. So I think it was a lot of US runners, and it was me from Europe, if I recall correctly. So I just spent some time in Mike's basement, and we were practicing some games. We went to MagFest, and we had a lot of fun there. And I can mention that as well. We had a showcase there for SDA for like we showed the many runs on a big screen, I think. So it was just great to meet everyone and discuss these games more in depth, so to say. We had a lot in common. So it was a great time.
Thanks everyone for listening and watching. If you're enjoying the podcast, please feel free, subscribe, like, leave a comment, all that stuff people say at the end of a video. It honestly all goes a long way to help the podcast. Thank you so much. If you want to join us on Discord, we chat mostly about food, but occasionally we do talk about the stuff that's in the podcast. The link is in the show notes or in the description. Feel free. Come on by. Join us. If you want to follow on Twitter, Sequence Break PC. Sequence Break PC. I post when I go live. It's kind of not at a set time, so if you want to see the live feed of the podcast, feel free, follow there. And finally, if you want to email, podcast@sequencebreakpodcast.com. Sequencebreakpodcast.com is also where you can find the backlog of all of the episodes. It's also on YouTube as well, so feel free, join in, have some fun. Thank you so much. I will see ya in the next one.